Good evening, everyone. Most often, after clinical death, people remember something pleasant. Unearthly light, communication with benevolent beings, a feeling of happiness. But sometimes stories that describe a terrible place full of suffering and despair. That is hell. In this episode, we will talk about people who claim to have been to hell. Assistant engineer Thomas Wilch from Oregon stumbled and fell from a height into the water, while working on a future sawmill, hitting the crossbar of the scaffolding. Several people saw it. Searches were immediately organized. After about an hour, he was found and brought back to life, but Thomas's soul was far away from the scene during this time. Having fallen from the catwalk, he found himself at a huge fiery ocean. This sight struck him and inspired horror. A lake of fire stretched around him and occupied the entire space. It bubbled and rumbled. There was no one in it, and Thomas himself was watching it from the side. But there were quite a lot of people around, not in the lake itself, but next to it. Thomas even recognized one of those, although he did not talk to him. They once studied together, but he died from cancer when he was a child. The surrounding people were in some kind of reverie, behaved as if confused, puzzled by the sight of a terrible fire lake, next to which they ended up. Thomas himself realized that he had gone to prison with them, from which there was no way out. He thought that if he had known in advance about the existence of such a place, he would have tried to do everything in his power during his lifetime not to return here. As soon as these thoughts flashed through his head, Jesus himself appeared in front of him. Thomas was glad because he believed that he would help him get out of there, but did not dare to ask for help. Jesus passed by without paying attention to Thomas. But before he left, he turned around and looked at our character. This look brought Thomas's soul back into his body. He heard the voices of people nearby, and then he was able to open his eyes and speak. This case was described in book Beyond Death's Door, by Maurice Rawlings. There you can also read a few more stories about how during clinical death souls found themselves in hell. One patient was dying of a heart attack. She started shortness of breath, and felt that she somehow had separated from her own body. Suddenly, she found herself in a gloomy room, where she saw a terrible creature of enormous size. It was watching her. Dwarfs and demons were running around. This monster beckoned her, and the woman went against her will. There was darkness all around, people were moaning. Someone was running around the woman all the time. She felt their touch on her legs. Then the tunnel ended. She woke up among even more vile creatures. She was crying, but could not change anything. But then the giant sent her back. Then she realized that she was pitied, and at the same moment, woke up in a hospital bed. Another patient began to have severe pain due to inflammation of the pancreas. He was given medications, but they did not help much, and he lost consciousness. At that moment, he began to leave through a long tunnel, surprised that his feet did not touch him, moving as if floating in space. This place was very similar to a dungeon or cave, filled with eerie sounds and smells of decay. He had forgotten some of what he had seen, but villains whose appearance was only half human surfaced in his memory. They spoke their language and mimicked each other. In despair, the dying man exclaimed, "Jesus, save me." Immediately, a man in a shining robe appeared and looked at him. He felt an instruction to live differently. The man did not remember anything else. Perhaps, the consciousness did not want to keep in mind all the horrors that he saw there. Kenneth Hagin, who became a priest after his clinical death, described his visions and experiences in a My Testimony pamphlet. On April 21, 1933, his heart stopped beating and his soul separated from his body. The soul descended lower and lower until the earthlight completely disappeared. At the very end, he ended up in pitch darkness, absolute blackness, where he could not even see a hand raised to his eyes. The further he descended, the hotter and stuffier the surroundings became. Then he found himself in front of the road to hell, where the fires of hell were visible. A fiery sphere was approaching him, which began to attract him to itself. The soul did not want to go, but could not resist, as it was attracted like iron to a magnet. Kenneth felt a rush of heat. He found himself at the bottom of the pit. There was a creature next to him. At first, he did not pay attention to it, fascinated by the picture of hell spread out in front of him. But this creature put a hand between his elbow and shoulder to guide him into hell itself. At that time, a voice rang out, the voice of God himself. The future priest did not understand the words, but he felt his strength and power. At that moment, his companion loosened his grip, and some force pulled him up. He found himself in his room and slipped into his body the same way he came out, through his mouth. The grandmother, with whom he woke up and spoke, confessed that she thought he was already dead. There is a description of hell in Orthodox books as well. One man, suffering from an illness, prayed to God to put him out of his suffering. The angel sent by him suggested that the sufferer, instead of 1 year on earth, spend 3 hours in hell to purify his soul. He agreed, but, as it turned out, in vain. It was the most disgusting place imaginable. Everywhere there was darkness, gloom, spirits of malice were hovering, the cries of sinners were heard, there was only suffering, nothing more. The soul of the patient experienced unspeakable fear and longing. But no one responded to his cries for help, except for the infernal echo and the bubbling of flames. It seemed to him that he had been there forever, although the angel who visited him explained that he was only asking for an hour. The sufferer begged him to take him away from this terrible place and was released. After that, he patiently endured his illness. According to the ideas of the Church, hell is a place where the souls of the dead are removed from God. Sinners are tormented by remorse and unsatisfied passions, so there is constantly crying and gnashing of teeth. The same needs that a person had on earth, in the underworld, will be tormented even more and will not be satisfied. A drug addict will have eternal withdrawal, a drunkard will have a hangover, a smoker will have a craving for tobacco. The gluttonous will suffer without food and the fornicator, from the desire of the flesh. But, oddly enough, hell was not created for punishments. It turns out, for a sinful soul, being near God is also a kind of torture. Because it, immersed in darkness, cannot rejoice in light and grace. The pictures of hell are scary and not attractive, but they give a reason to think about a lot, to reconsider your attitude to life, to your desires and goals.